Imagine a village so completely silenced by fear that not a single soldier dared cross an open street, not a medic could reach the wounded, and an entire Allied advance had been stopped cold by the invisible patience of 11 men hidden somewhere in the ruins. This was not a battlefield of thundering artillery or massed infantry charges. This was something far more terrifying, a war fought in absolute silence, where the only sound that mattered came a fraction of a second too late for the man who heard it. It was the autumn of 1944, in the shattered villages of northwestern Europe, where the liberation of the continent had slowed to a crawl not because of tank divisions or fortified lines, but because of individual German snipers, trained specialists of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS who had mastered the art of denial, the ability to make an entire landscape uninhabitable through the threat of a single, perfectly placed bullet. Allied commanders had learned to dread these situations. A sniper nest could hold up a regiment for hours, inflict casualties that shattered morale, and force command decisions that rippled far up the chain of leadership. And on this particular morning, 11 of them had turned a liberated French village into a killing ground that no one could explain how to clear, until one rifleman decided to stop thinking about the problem the way everyone else was thinking about it. What happened next would become one of the most quietly remarkable individual combat actions of the entire Western Front campaign. If you have never heard this story, you are exactly where you need to be right now. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who loves real history, and leave a comment telling us what you already know about World War II snipers, because what comes next may completely change what you thought you knew. To understand what that rifleman faced on that autumn morning, you first have to understand what the German sniper program had become by 1944, because it was not the improvised, opportunistic role that popular imagination sometimes assigns it. The Wehrmacht had been training dedicated sharpshooters since the early years of the conflict, but it was the brutal experience of the Eastern Front, the frozen killing fields of Stalingrad, the endless steppes of Operation Barbarossa, and the siege warfare around Leningrad that transformed the German military's approach to sniping from a supplementary tactic into a core defensive doctrine. By the time the Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, German sniper doctrine had been refined through millions of casualties on both sides and thousands of hours of battlefield observation. The standard-issue weapon for the German designated marksman was often the Karabiner 98K fitted with a Zeiss or a JAK telescopic sight, a rifle that in trained hands could deliver lethal accuracy at ranges exceeding 600 meters under favorable conditions. More specialized units received the Gewehr 43, a semi-automatic rifle that offered faster follow-up shots without requiring the shooter to break his cheek weld, an enormous tactical advantage in urban environments. German sniper candidates were selected not merely for marksmanship but for psychological resilience, patience, and the ability to remain completely motionless for hours in positions that would drive an ordinary soldier to movement within minutes. They were taught to read wind, to compensate for mirage, to estimate range without instruments, and above all, to choose positions that offered multiple escape routes and overlapping fields of fire. By September 1944, as Allied forces pushed through Belgium, Luxembourg, and into the edges of Germany itself, these men were fighting a rearguard action for which they were uniquely suited, slowing, bleeding, and demoralizing an advancing army one carefully chosen shot at a time. The specific village in question sits within the broader context of Operation Market Garden's aftermath and the brutal grinding advance through the Siegfried Line's outer approaches during the autumn of 1944, a period that military historians like Max Hastings and Antony Beevor have described as among the most psychologically wearing of the entire European campaign. After the extraordinary optimism of the summer breakout from Normandy, after the liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, and the sweeping advances that had Allied soldiers believing the war might end before Christmas, the momentum had collapsed into something far grimmer. Supply lines were stretched to breaking point, fuel shortages were crippling armored advances, and the German military, written off prematurely by Allied planners, had performed one of the most remarkable defensive reconstitutions in modern military history. Field Marshal Walter Model, known to his own troops as the Führer's fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts, had patched together a coherent defensive line from the fragments of shattered divisions, and along that line, in every village, every tree line, every ruined farmhouse and collapsed church steeple, German commanders had placed their most valuable defensive assets, the snipers who could freeze entire battalions in place with nothing more than the threat of accurate fire. The village this story concerns had been nominally cleared by advancing Allied infantry the previous day, a process that consisted of a brief firefight, the apparent withdrawal of German regular forces, and the cautious entry of Allied troops who believed, as troops so often do in war, what they needed to believe to keep moving forward. What they had not accounted for was that the German command had deliberately left 11 snipers behind, not to hold the village in any conventional sense, but to make it functionally impassable, to turn every window, every doorway, every alley into a potential death sentence, and to ensure that Allied momentum stopped there, in that place, on that day. The morning the situation crystallized into crisis began before dawn, when a dispatch runner attempting to cross the village's main square was struck and killed before he had taken 10 steps into the open. The shot came from an unknown direction, a classic signature of a well-positioned sniper who understood the acoustic deception that rubble and broken walls could create. Within the next 30 minutes, 2 more men were hit, one fatally, both in different parts of the village, which told the Allied officers present something deeply alarming. This was not one sniper with a single position, but multiple shooters with coordinated fields of fire that covered the village's key movement corridors. By 7 in the morning, with the autumn light gray and flat over the shattered rooftops, the situation had been communicated up the chain of command, and the answer that came back down was essentially no answer at all. Call for artillery, but risk destroying the village's structural integrity and burying your own men in rubble. Wait for darkness, but lose an entire day of operational momentum that commanders above them were demanding. Or solve it with what you had. It was in this moment, with officers gathered in the cellar of a partially destroyed farmhouse on the village's western edge, that a British rifleman, a veteran of North Africa, Sicily, and the Normandy landings, a man who had been fighting this war since before most of his current unit had been in uniform, offered a proposition that was either brilliant or insane, and in the arithmetic of that morning, the difference between those two descriptions was almost irrelevant. He had been watching the patterns. He had been listening to where shots came from and mapping them against the village's geography in his mind. And he believed he had identified a method, not a plan in any conventional military sense, but a method that could systematically locate and neutralize each shooter without exposing himself in the conventional ways that had already gotten 3 men killed that morning. The method he proposed drew on principles that military historians would later recognize as a synthesis of several established countersniper techniques that had been developed independently by different armies across different theaters of the war. On the Eastern Front, Soviet snipers like Vasily Zaitsev had pioneered the use of carefully positioned dummy figures, helmets raised on sticks or coats stuffed with straw and positioned in windows, to provoke enemy snipers into revealing their positions through muzzle flash or the disturbance of dust and debris. The British had developed similar techniques in the Western Desert Campaign under commanders like General Bernard Montgomery, where the flat, featureless terrain of North Africa had made the sniper duel one of the defining microtactics of the campaign. What this particular rifleman proposed was a systematic application of these ideas within an urban environment, using the village's own shattered architecture as his laboratory. The windows were the key, not as firing positions for himself, though they would serve that purpose, but as observation platforms from which he could control the angles and light conditions that a well-trained sniper would be compelled to respond to. He understood something fundamental about the German snipers' training. They had been taught to hold their fire, to wait for certainty before shooting, but they had also been taught that a clean shot at a moving target in a confirmed Allied position was an opportunity that served the mission. By creating the appearance of movement and activity in calculated locations, he could induce each sniper to reveal himself through the one thing that a sniper, in the moment of shooting, cannot entirely conceal, the relationship between his muzzle and the light. The execution of what would become a 4-hour operation began at approximately 9 in the morning, with the rifleman having positioned himself in the upper floor of a stone-built house on the village's northern edge, a structure whose thick walls had survived the preceding day's fighting largely intact and which offered sight lines across a significant portion of the village's roofline and upper stories. He was accompanied by a single observer, a young corporal whose job was to watch the areas the rifleman could not simultaneously cover, to track the precise origin points of any shots fired, and to relay observations in whispers that would not carry beyond the room. The first hour produced nothing but silence and the distant sound of artillery somewhere to the east, a reminder that the war was proceeding everywhere except here, where 11 invisible men had frozen time. Then, at approximately 10 o'clock, the rifleman introduced his first provocation. A helmet raised slowly into a window frame on the building's southern face, held there by a broomstick, moving with the slight irregular motion of a man looking cautiously out. The shot that came was immediate and precise, shattering plaster 6 inches above where a head would have been, and in the millisecond of its arrival, the observer caught the flash, not from the direction anyone had expected, but from a position in the village church's partially collapsed bell tower, a location that every Allied soldier had assumed was too exposed to be usable. It was not. The German sniper there had constructed a hide within the rubble of the collapsed masonry that was effectively invisible from ground level and only detectable from above and at a specific angle. The rifleman adjusted his position, waited 11 minutes for the German to relax back into stillness, and then placed a single shot through the precise gap in the masonry where the flash had originated. This is the midpoint of a story that deserves every second of your attention, and if you are still watching, you already understand why this matters, not just as military history, but as a study in human intelligence under pressure, in the kind of thinking that saves lives when conventional answers have run out. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, like this video because it helps more people find stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs to understand what real courage looks like, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most so far, because the next 4 eliminations happen in a sequence that becomes almost mathematical in its precision, and the story behind the last 2 snipers involves a decision that still divides military historians today. The second and third snipers were located within 40 minutes of the first, their positions betrayed by the same fundamental vulnerability, the inability to resist a clean shot at what appeared to be a valid target. The rifleman's method had a psychological dimension that went beyond the purely technical. He understood that these German snipers, however well trained, had been isolated in a village behind enemy lines for more than 24 hours, that their mission was both dangerous and finite, and that the combination of professional pride, isolation, and the pressure of their orders would make them slightly more willing to take shots than a sniper operating with full support and clear communications. Might be. Isolation degrades judgment. It compresses the internal calculus between patience and action. And for men whose entire tactical value depended on patience, any compression of that calculus was a potentially fatal vulnerability. The third sniper's position, revealed by a double flash that suggested a semi-automatic weapon, likely a Gur 43, was in the ruins of what had been the village butcher's shop, a ground-floor position that violated every principle of elevated sniping doctrine but which commanded a perfect view of the main supply route into the village from the south. By early afternoon, with 6 of the 11 snipers accounted for, the remaining 5 had gone completely silent, and silence, paradoxically, was the most dangerous development of the morning. 5 trained snipers who had watched 6 of their colleagues eliminated by an enemy they could not locate or target were now operating at the absolute maximum of their professional discipline, and the ordinary provocations that had worked earlier were unlikely to work again. The rifleman understood this. He spent nearly 40 minutes simply observing, moving carefully between positions within his building, studying the village's topography with the methodical patience that had kept him alive through campaigns in 3 different theaters of the war. What he was doing, in the terminology that military analysts would later apply, was building a mental model of the remaining positions based not on what he could see but on what he could not see, the areas that had no line of sight to his current position, the locations that a surviving sniper would logically migrate to after watching his colleagues be picked off from the north, the positions that offered both concealment and an escape route toward the German lines to the east. This kind of reasoning, working backward from tactical logic to probable position, was not unique to this rifleman. American sharpshooter Carlos Hathcock would later describe similar processes in Vietnam, and Soviet sniper accounts from Stalingrad are full of the same patient geometric reasoning. But in the context of this particular morning, in this particular village, with 5 hidden men who had already demonstrated lethal capability and were now fully alert to the danger, it represented a level of controlled analytical thinking under extreme stress that most human beings are simply not capable of sustaining. The final 5 eliminations unfolded over the last 90 minutes of the operation in a sequence that demonstrated both the rifleman's method and its limits, because the last 2 snipers did not behave as their colleagues had behaved, and the story of how they were ultimately accounted for contains a moral complexity that the clean narrative of tactical success tends to obscure. The 9th sniper was located through a method that the rifleman had not planned but recognized in the moment. A slight displacement of brick dust from a position in the village's surviving mill structure, caused not by the sniper firing but by the sniper shifting his weight after more than 5 hours in a static position, an involuntary movement driven by the simple biological reality that the human body, however disciplined, cannot remain perfectly still indefinitely. The 10th sniper gave himself away through sound rather than sight, the minute metallic click of a rifle bolt being worked, carrying through the still afternoon air to the rifleman's position in a moment of absolute silence between distant artillery reports. But the 11th sniper, the last one, did not give himself away at all. He was found because a French civilian, a woman in her 60s who had hidden in her cellar throughout the entire preceding day and the morning's silent battle, emerged cautiously from her hiding place, saw a German soldier in the ruins of her neighbor's house, and pointed. She simply pointed. And in the pointing, in that single gesture from a woman who had endured occupation, liberation, and then this terrible recurrence of danger all within the span of 48 hours, the operation reached its conclusion. The 11th sniper was taken prisoner, the only one of the 11 who survived the morning, and what he said in interrogation about his orders, his training, and his opinion of what had happened to his colleagues over the preceding 4 hours was recorded by Allied intelligence and adds a final layer of human texture to a story that is, at its core, about the terrifying intimacy of a particular kind of warfare. What the German prisoner said, as recorded in Allied intelligence documents that have since been reviewed by military historians including those contributing to the comprehensive studies of Western Front infantry combat published in the decades following the war, was that he had known, from the moment the second shot found its mark in the church bell tower, that whoever was hunting them understood the method. He said he had spent the rest of the morning trying to calculate what he would do, where he would move, how he would respond, if he were the man doing the hunting rather than the man being hunted, and that this reversal of perspective, this attempt to think like the enemy rifleman, had paralyzed him more completely than any artillery barrage or infantry assault could have done. Because when he tried to think like the man hunting him, he found he could not identify a flaw in the approach, could not locate the gap that would allow escape or counteraction, and that realization, the realization that an opponent has thought through your situation as carefully as you have, is one of the most psychologically devastating experiences available to a human being in conflict. The village was fully operational by 4 in the afternoon. Supply convoys moved through it before dark. The Allied advance resumed the following morning. The rifleman who had spent 4 hours working through 11 positions with nothing but his rifle, a borrowed broomstick, a young corporal with good eyes, and the accumulated knowledge of 3 years of war received a military commendation that described his action in the measured, understated language that British military citations traditionally favor. History, as it so often does with the actions of individual soldiers, moved on quickly. But the story did not disappear. It survived in unit diaries, in intelligence reports, in the memoirs of men who were there and understood what they had witnessed. And now it has survived into this moment, into your awareness, which is where all history ultimately lives or dies. If the story moved you, if it taught you something, if it made you see the Second World War's human dimension more clearly, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who deserves to know that history's most extraordinary moments often happened in silence, in ruined villages, through windows, one careful breath at a time. Leave a comment below telling us what detail from this story struck you hardest, because the conversation that happens in the comments of videos like this one is where real historical understanding begins.